Persistent service asset, the Redeemer dependent dividend ledger, founding rationale, archival copy.
Asset Part 18. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. August 15, 2026. Chapter 124. 2 notebooks. They began the next morning without activating the protocol. That decision had been made collectively, although none of them would have described it as a decision in quite the same way. The old engineer regarded it as a temporary suspension of an unsafe procedure. Elena regarded it as a controlled experiment. Vasper considered it an act of self-preservation. Tomas, who had the most to gain and perhaps the most to lose, regarded it as an opportunity to find out whether there was anything left of the person he had been before the systems had begun deciding what he was permitted to remember. The arrangement was simple enough that it seemed almost primitive beside the machinery beneath the skull. Each of them would keep a notebook. Neither would read the other's entries. Neither would volunteer a memory to the other until it had first been recorded independently. If a memory returned later in a different form, the new version would be recorded separately rather than used to correct the earlier one. They would record physical details whenever they could. Temperature, smell, posture, sounds, surfaces, the position of doors and windows, the presence or absence of other people. If something appeared only as an emotion or a bodily sensation, that would be recorded too, without trying to manufacture a story around it. The old engineer had insisted on that last point. "Don't turn sensations into explanations," he told them over coffee. "The brain hates an empty space. If you give it a smell, it'll give you a room. Give it a voice, it'll give you a person. Give it fear, it'll give you a reason. You need to distinguish what returned from what your mind supplied afterward." Vasper had looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You make remembering sound like an unreliable witness." "It is." "Then why trust it?" "I didn't say you should trust it. I'm saying you should listen to it carefully." Tomas had laughed at that, and the old engineer had smiled. It was the first time the three of them had managed to talk about the problem without treating it as an emergency. They had agreed that the notebooks would remain physically separate. Vasper kept hers in the small apartment she shared with her sister, inside a drawer beneath a collection of ordinary documents. Tomas kept his in the workshop attached to the professional guild's offices. Neither carried the notebook routinely. Neither stored it in the Skull's network. The irony was not lost on them. They had spent their first day trying to prevent the most sophisticated intelligence infrastructure any of them had ever encountered from interfering with their memories, and their chosen defense was paper. It was not nostalgia. It was isolation. Paper could not silently synchronize itself with another notebook. Vasper's first entry contained only 6 lines. She wrote them at 7 in the morning, before speaking to anyone. She remembered a room with glass walls. She remembered that the glass was not transparent from the outside. She remembered a man sitting across from her. She remembered being angry with him. She remembered a sentence, "You are making yourself unnecessary." She could not remember who had said it. She could not remember whether the statement had been an accusation or an observation. The final line took her several minutes. "I remember agreeing." She put down the pen. Her sister was in the kitchen making breakfast. Vasper could hear the refrigerator open and close, then the sound of a pan being placed on the stove. For a moment, the ordinary sounds seemed more convincing than the memory. The kitchen was real. The coffee was real. Her sister was real. The room with the glass walls belonged to an uncertain past that could not be independently verified. She closed the notebook. Her sister entered carrying 2 plates. "Did you sleep?" "Some." "That's not an answer. It's the best one I've got." Her sister placed a plate in front of her and sat down. She had become careful around the subject of memory. At first she had asked questions whenever Vasper mentioned something. Now she seemed to understand that questions themselves could become contaminating. She ate in silence for several minutes. Then she said, "You don't have to tell me." Vasper looked up. "Tell you what?" "If you remembered something." "I did." Her sister stopped eating. Vasper smiled slightly. "I'm not telling you." Her sister looked disappointed, then relieved. I suppose that's fair. It is. I hate this. So do I. Her sister pushed her plate away. Do you think I'm part of it? Vasper knew what she meant. The trust. The inheritance. The documents. The strange instructions that had begun appearing after the discovery beneath the skull. I think you're inside it, Vasper said. That's different. How? Being inside something doesn't mean you designed it. Her sister looked down at the table. I sometimes think I inherited a machine without knowing what it does. You inherited a trust. That's what I said. Vasper smiled. Her sister did not. After a moment she said, there are accounts I still can't access. Because of the court? No, because the trust itself won't authorize me. Vasper stopped. What do you mean? It recognizes me as the beneficiary. It recognizes me as the custodian. But there are layers where it doesn't recognize me as the person authorized to act. Who is? I don't know. Vasper thought about the protocol beneath the skull. Maybe nobody. Her sister looked at her. That would be worse. Why? Because if nobody is authorized, then something else is deciding. Vasper had no answer. She finished her coffee and went to work. Tomas's first entry was longer. He had woken before dawn with the feeling that someone was standing beside his bed. There had been no one there. He had checked the room, then the corridor, then the external perimeter. Nothing. The sensation had persisted. He described it carefully in the notebook without naming it as fear. Then he wrote about the smell. Not the room. The smell. Metal, ozone, filtered air, and something faintly sweet that he could not identify. He had smelled it before, perhaps many times, but every time he tried to associate it with a place, the association disappeared. He drew a rough diagram. A rectangular room. 3 walls visible. A vertical structure in the center. A circular opening. He did not know what the opening was for. He drew it anyway. Then he added something he had initially considered irrelevant. A person's hand resting on the edge of the structure. The hand had been wearing a glove. Not a spacesuit glove. Something lighter. The person had been standing to his left. He looked at the drawing. The hand seemed familiar. Not the person. The hand. He added another detail. A thin black band around the wrist. He stared at the page. His body reacted before his mind did. His heart accelerated. His shoulders tightened. He closed the notebook. He would return to it later. The first week passed without a dramatic breakthrough. That was useful. The memories did not arrive on command. Some days produced nothing. On others, one of them would experience a sudden fragment while doing something completely ordinary. Vasper remembered a diplomatic conference while waiting for an elevator. Tomas remembered an orbital maintenance procedure while watching a mechanic replace a component on a delivery drone. Neither told the other. The rule was becoming easier. The attraction between them made it harder. They were falling in love, although neither had yet used that phrase. It was not an immediate or theatrical transformation. They had simply begun to rely on one another's presence. Tomas had learned that Vasper liked to walk after difficult conversations rather than remain seated. Vasper had learned that Tomas became quiet when overwhelmed and that silence did not mean anger. He had discovered that she sometimes translated expressions from one language into another in her head before answering. She had discovered that he often looked at machines the way other people looked at landscapes. Their intimacy developed through observation. That made the notebooks more difficult. They were trying to build a relationship while refusing to use one another as evidence. One evening, after a long meeting, Vasper found Tomas sitting outside the guild offices. You didn't write today. He looked at her. How do you know? You've got the notebook. She pointed at the pocket of his jacket. I could have been writing about something else. You weren't. How do you know? She sat beside him. Because you're looking at the road like it offended you. He laughed. I remembered something. She waited. He did not tell her. She nodded. Good. You're not going to ask? I want to. But I don't want to know yet. He looked at her. That's becoming our strangest form of intimacy. She smiled. I know. They sat together. Below them, the lower deck was handling a sequence of deliveries. A Skyfish drone came in low, its navigation lights reflected in the glass. It settled into a docking cradle, transferred its payload, and departed again. A participating taxista took another package from the handoff point and left by road. Tomas watched the movement. Do you know what I like about that? What? Nobody is pretending the machine can do everything. Vasper followed his gaze. The drone does what the drone does. The driver does what the driver does. And the system coordinates them. Exactly. She looked at him. You're thinking about us. Maybe. You think we're like that? He considered it. I think I don't know what we're like yet. She accepted the answer. That was one of the things she liked about him. He was learning not to manufacture certainty. The second week produced the first useful correlation. Vasper remembered a conversation. Tomas remembered a room. Neither had enough information to connect them. Vasper's memory came while she was speaking to a representative of the hotel association. The man had made an offhand remark about the Skull's projected logistics capacity, and something about his phrasing triggered a memory of a diplomatic meeting years earlier. She had been negotiating with someone who represented a consortium of infrastructure companies. The company had not been Redeemer. She was almost certain of that. The representative had been discussing continuity infrastructure and distributed authority. She remembered challenging him about the assumption that technical systems could remain politically neutral once they became essential to a government's functioning. She had apparently said that whoever controlled the system would eventually control the decisions that depended upon it. The man had replied that the opposite was true. Whoever governed the system would eventually become dependent upon the system. She had not understood what he meant. Now she did. She wrote the memory down that evening. Tomas, meanwhile, had experienced something different. He had been watching the Skull's traffic model when a route visualization suddenly became incomprehensible to him. The system showed hundreds of autonomous vehicles converging toward a set of nodes. To everyone else in the room, the display looked normal. To Tomas, it looked wrong. He could not explain why. He asked the operator to pause the model. What am I looking at? The operator showed him the routing layer. It's a demand redistribution. No. What's wrong? Tomas pointed at the screen. These aren't demand nodes. What are they? He stared. Dependencies. The operator looked confused. Tomas could not explain the difference. He knew only that the system was showing the routes as movements between locations when the more important information was the relationship between the locations. A small node could be more important than a large one if other systems depended upon it. He had seen that before. Where? He didn't know. The operator asked him to leave the model running. Tomas stayed. He spent an hour rearranging the visualization. When he finished, the pattern looked different. The largest nodes were no longer the most important. Several tiny facilities had become critical. A maintenance depot, a charging station, a communications relay, a financial settlement point, a warehouse, a human dispatch office. The system had been optimizing transportation. Tomas had unconsciously modeled resilience. He looked at the result. That's what they taught us. The operator heard him. Who? Tomas shook his head. I don't know. Vasper read his notebook entry 3 days later. Not because he had violated their rule. He had not. He had shown her the page after writing it. Once he was certain the original entry had been preserved. She had done the same with hers. They placed the notebooks on opposite sides of the table. Neither touched the other's pages. They read. The memories were different. The implications were not. Vasper's remembered conversation concerned distributed authority. Tomas's memory concerned distributed dependencies. Both had been taught to think in systems. Both had been trained to identify relationships rather than individual components. Both had apparently been designed for environments where no single point of failure could be allowed to determine the outcome. The old engineer read the two entries. He did not immediately speak. Finally he said, "This is why they separated you." Vasper looked at him. "Because we were good at the same thing?" "No." "Then what?" "Because you were good at complementary things." He explained that the diplomatic PSA architecture was designed to model institutional relationships. Tomas's operational architecture had been designed to model physical dependencies. One could see who had authority. The other could see what had to remain functioning. Separately, each could be managed. Together, they could reconstruct an entire system. Vasper thought about that. That's not necessarily dangerous. No. What is? If the system you're analyzing is trying to hide itself. Tomas looked at him. The engineer immediately shook his head. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you why the architecture was designed the way it was. Vasper watched him carefully. He was telling the truth. At least as far as he knew it. The third week brought an unexpected visitor. She arrived without an appointment and asked for Vasper by her old diplomatic designation. Not her name. The designation. The receptionist assumed she had made a mistake. Vasper did not. She came downstairs. The visitor was an elderly woman who had once worked in international infrastructure regulation. She had known Vasper before the latter had become redundant, although she had never been one of her direct colleagues. You remember me? Vasper asked. No. The woman smiled. Good. Vasper stared at her. Why is that good? Because if you remembered me, I'd have to wonder whether somebody had restored the wrong part. The woman handed her a small envelope. Vasper did not open it. What is this? Something I was instructed to give you if you ever became independent again. Vasper looked at her. Independent from what? The woman smiled sadly. That's what you used to ask. Did I ever get an answer? No. Why not? Because the people who knew the answer were afraid of what you'd do with it. Vasper looked toward the stairs. Tomas was coming down. The woman's eyes moved toward him. She stopped. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then she said, almost to herself, They found each other. Tomas heard her. What? The woman looked at Vasper. Nothing. Vasper opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. Not digital. A physical print. It showed a room she recognized immediately. The glass walls. The circular structure. The room from her first notebook entry. There were 6 people visible. She recognized none of them, except one. Tomas. He was younger. Not physically younger. Different. He was standing behind her. His hand was resting on the circular structure. The thin black band was visible around his wrist. Vasper looked at Tomas. He had gone completely still. He took the photograph. His expression changed. Where did you get this? The woman did not answer. Vasper turned the photograph over. There was writing on the back. A date. A location. And a single sentence. They were never supposed to meet after the return. Tomas read it. Vasper watched him. Neither spoke. The old rule about not supplying context suddenly seemed inadequate. The photograph had supplied context for them. The dangerous kind. The kind neither could unsee. That evening they returned to the independent laboratory. They did not activate the reintegration protocol. Instead, they scanned the photograph, sealed the original, and began comparing it against the available records. The old engineer found the location. It was not on Earth. It was an orbital facility. Tomas stared at the coordinates. He remembered the station. Not the whole station. Corridor. Pressure door. A maintenance bay. Then the room. Then Vasper. Not as she looked now. As she had looked then. She was speaking to him. He could not hear the words. He could see her mouth moving. He could see his own hand on the structure. He could see something else. A display behind them. A map. Not of the Earth. Of a network. He leaned forward. Stop. The engineer froze the image. Tomas pointed. That. The screen enlarged. The map was too degraded to interpret. But it contained several nodes. One of them was over Mexico. Another was over Indonesia. Another over the Philippines. Several others were scattered across the world. Vasper stepped closer. Those aren't countries. No, Tomas said. What are they? He looked at the map. I don't know. The old engineer stared at it. Then he looked at Tomas. What do you remember? Tomas closed his eyes. I remember being told that the system had to survive even if the governments didn't. Vasper felt something cold move through her. Who told you? I don't know. Did you believe them? He opened his eyes. I think I argued. What did you say? He shook his head. I don't remember. Vasper looked at the map again. The nodes over Mexico, Indonesia, and the Philippines seemed unrelated. But the consortium already had clients in those countries. She thought about the skull, the independent stack, the archipelago, the professional guilds, the infrastructure that had begun to emerge around Aldea Zama. For the first time, she saw a possibility that frightened her more than the possibility that she might recover her past. Perhaps their past was not simply about what had happened to them. Perhaps it was about what they had been designed to observe. She closed the notebook. We're not ready. Tomas nodded. The old engineer looked at them. Ready for what? Vasper looked toward the window. Beyond it, the skull was operating through another ordinary night. Skyfish drones came and went. Human couriers carried packages from the lower decks. Autonomous vehicles moved along the protected corridors. Maintenance systems checked the machinery. People lived around it, worked around it, and increasingly depended upon it. Nothing about the scene suggested that any of it was connected to a forgotten orbital program. Nothing suggested that two damaged, persistent assets might someday become important to something much larger. For now, they were simply two people with notebooks, a photograph and memories they did not yet trust. Vasper reached for Tomas's hand. He let her. They would not ask the machine to tell them who they were. Not yet. They would find out the slow way, one unreliable memory at a time, and try to remain themselves while doing it. Chapter 125. A Redundant Woman. Vasper had always believed that redundancy was one of the cleaner forms of professional success. The belief had been useful because it allowed her to leave things behind without admitting that leaving them hurt. A diplomat who could not make herself unnecessary was, in her private estimation, merely a bureaucrat with good manners. The real measure of a diplomatic mission was whether the machinery continued to function after the diplomat disappeared from it. She had therefore spent years training replacements, documenting procedures, transferring relationships, and deliberately reducing the number of decisions that required her personal intervention. She had taught younger officers how to read a room before anyone spoke, how to recognize the difference between a minister who wanted an agreement and one who wanted the appearance of an agreement, how to determine which aide actually carried the principal's confidence, and how to leave a negotiation without making the other side feel abandoned. She had been very good at it. Too good, perhaps. Now, with her memory returning in fragments, the achievement had begun to look different. She was sitting in the temporary diplomatic office overlooking the eastern side of the skull when she realized that she had spent 20 minutes watching a meeting without hearing a word of it. The people around the table were discussing the latest access road proposal. The ground truthers wanted additional guarantees concerning future settlement rights. The infrastructure consortium wanted certainty that the road corridor would remain available as the Skulls logistics traffic increased. The municipal representative wanted a timetable because the previous timetable had become politically embarrassing. Someone from the hotel association was arguing that the road was already becoming a regional economic artery and should therefore be treated as public infrastructure. Vasper had been expected to mediate. She was good at this sort of thing. She could usually tell who had entered the room with a fixed position and who had entered with a number they intended to trade. She could identify which objection was real and which one was being used to establish bargaining leverage. She could see when someone was about to concede before they themselves had decided to concede. That ability had returned before any explicit memory had. It was simply there. She had begun noticing it 2 weeks earlier, and until now she had treated it as instinct. The conversation around the table suddenly shifted. A municipal official proposed that the ground truthers be compensated for the parcels affected by the access road according to current market value. One of the ground truthers laughed. Vasper understood immediately why. The market value was precisely the problem. The land was not being valued as land. It was being valued as a future development opportunity, and the ground truthers were being asked to surrender part of their position in that future in exchange for the price someone else had calculated. She looked at the official. "You're offering them the value of what they own today." The man frowned. "Yes. But the road increases the value of everything around it. That's why we're offering above current assessed value. You're still calculating the compensation from the wrong baseline." He looked irritated. Vasper continued before he could answer. "The question isn't what the parcels are worth without the road. It's what economic value the road creates and how much of that value is being created by taking those parcels. If you compensate them only for the land, you're asking them to subsidize the infrastructure that will make the rest of the district more valuable." The ground truthers representative looked at her. She could see the exact moment he decided she had understood the issue. The municipal official leaned back. "Then what do you suggest?" Vasper looked around the table. "A development participation mechanism. The affected parcels receive a defined share of the incremental value attributable to the corridor, with the ecological restrictions preserved. They aren't selling the future to you. They're participating in it." The room went quiet. The proposal was not revolutionary. That was what made it useful. It converted an argument about property into an argument about value creation. And once the participants began discussing the latter, several previously irreconcilable positions became negotiable. The meeting continued for another hour. By the end, nobody had received everything they wanted. The ground truthers had not surrendered their objections. The municipality had not received the unconditional road access it wanted. The infrastructure people had not received absolute guarantees. But everyone had agreed to return with numbers. As the participants filed out, the municipal official stopped beside Vasper. "Where did you learn to do that?" She looked at him. "Do what?" "Turn a fight into a contract." She smiled. "I don't remember." He assumed she was joking. She wasn't. That evening she wrote it down. "I knew what they were going to say before they said it. Then, beneath it, I knew which argument would move the room. And finally, I did not learn this here." She closed the notebook. Tomas was working downstairs with the Robotics Guild. She could hear the occasional metallic clatter from the maintenance deck, followed by the muffled voices of technicians. She had deliberately avoided going down to see him after the meeting. She needed to determine whether what had happened was memory or merely competence. The distinction mattered. She had been a diplomat for most of her adult life. Of course she knew how to negotiate. Perhaps nothing had returned. Perhaps she was simply doing what she had always done. The problem was that she had begun noticing details that exceeded her conscious training. Person's breathing. The position of a hand. The moment someone stopped listening to the person speaking and began listening to the person they expected to speak next. Those things had been automatic. Not learned. Automatic. She remembered knowing them before she remembered learning them. That was different. The next morning she received a message from a woman she had never met. At least she thought she had never met her. The message contained only a location and a time. No explanation. Vasper almost deleted it. Instead she went. The address was an old diplomatic facility that had been converted into offices during the first wave of institutional restructuring. The building had survived several governments, 2 major renovations, and 1 attempted redevelopment that had been abandoned when the financing collapsed. It had the peculiar smell of old public buildings. Dust, polished stone, overheated electrical equipment, and the faint residue of generations of coffee. The woman waiting for her was in her 70s. She stood when Vasper entered. For a moment neither spoke. Then the woman smiled. "You look exactly the same." Vasper stopped. "That isn't possible." "No," the woman said. "It isn't." She gestured toward a chair. Vasper remained standing. "Who are you?" "My name won't help you. Try me." The woman smiled. "That's the Vasper I remember." The name struck her strangely. Not because the woman had used it, because she had used it without hesitation. Vasper sat. The woman remained opposite her. "You trained me," she said. Vasper frowned. "I don't remember you." "I know." "How long ago?" 30 years. Vasper felt something move through her chest. 30 years. The number itself meant little. But the woman was looking at her with the uncomfortable familiarity of someone who had once depended upon her. "You were my replacement." The woman nodded. "You were supposed to be." Vasper stared at her. "Supposed to be? You trained me to take your place. You gave me your contacts, your procedures, your negotiation maps, your personal notes on certain governments, and a ridiculous amount of advice about coffee." Despite herself, Vasper smiled. "I don't remember the coffee. You hated bad coffee. I still do." Then some things survived. The woman's smile disappeared. "You made yourself redundant." Vasper felt the phrase from her notebook return. "You are making yourself unnecessary." She looked at the woman. "Why?" "You told me that institutions should not depend upon individuals." "That sounds like me." "You also told me that if an institution couldn't survive the departure of one person, it wasn't an institution. It was a personality cult." Vasper laughed softly. "Definitely me." The woman did not laugh. "You weren't trying to advance your career." Vasper stopped. "What?" "You were trying to disappear." The woman explained that Vasper had begun training her replacement unusually early. At first, everyone had assumed it was simply evidence of professional discipline. Vasper had insisted that the younger diplomat accompany her to meetings where she would normally have gone alone. She had introduced her to contacts who would ordinarily have been considered too senior for someone at her level. She had gradually allowed the younger woman to take over negotiations while remaining in the background. Then she had started transferring information that was not normally transferred. Not classified information. Institutional memory. The kind that never appeared in official records. Who distrusted whom? Which promises were real? Which ones were made for domestic audiences? Which ministries had overlapping authority? Which ministers had learned to circumvent their own bureaucracies? Which governments were stable because of law and which were stable because 3 people had known one another for 20 years? Vasper had taught her all of it. Then, one morning, Vasper had disappeared from the assignment. Not dramatically. There had been no dismissal, no scandal, no announcement. She had simply ceased to be necessary. Her replacement had taken over. The institution continued functioning, exactly as Vasper had intended. "What happened to you afterward?" Vasper asked. The woman hesitated. "You became something else." What? I don't know. That's not an answer. It's the truth. The woman reached into her bag and removed a small folder. Inside were photocopies of old documents. Vasper recognized several immediately. Diplomatic cables, meeting records, technical memoranda. One document contained a list of international infrastructure projects. She recognized the terminology: distributed continuity, resilient governance, independent computational environments. She felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes. Where did you get these? You gave them to me. No. You gave me copies. Why? The woman looked at her. Because you told me that one day I might need to understand why you had spent so much of your career making yourself replaceable. Vasper opened the next page. There was a handwritten note. She recognized the handwriting. Her own. A system that survives its people is resilient. A system that survives only because its people remain ignorant is not. She stared at it. The sentence did not feel like a memory. It felt like a principle. She remembered writing it. She remembered why. Then the memory broke. A room. Glass walls. A man. Tomas. She saw him standing several meters away. She saw herself arguing with someone she could not identify. And then she saw something that had never appeared before. A map. Mexico. Not as a country. As a system of dependencies. Ports. Energy. Communications. Financial institutions. Food. Transport. Water. Political authority. The image vanished. Vasper gripped the edge of the table. The woman across from her stood. Are you all right? Yes. You don't look all right. I remembered something. What? Vasper looked at her. For the first time, she believed that the woman might be able to help. But the old rule returned. Record first. Tell later. She shook her head. Nothing I can explain yet. The woman nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. When Vasper returned to Aldea Zama, Tomas was waiting outside the guild offices. He had been there long enough that she knew he had deliberately chosen not to go looking for her. You knew I'd come back. Yes. How? You always come back from difficult meetings walking faster than when you leave. She looked at him. That's creepy. I've been practicing. She smiled. Then she noticed the notebook in his hand. You remembered something. Yes. Want to tell me? He looked at her. No. Good. They walked together toward the skull. The afternoon heat had softened, and the construction district had settled into its newer rhythm. The upper exclosure caught the sun differently depending on the surface. The solar panels on the illuminated side were already beginning to turn toward the changing angle of the light, while the LED panels on the opposite surface remained dormant until evening. Maintenance drones moved around the structure, inspecting joints and exterior surfaces. On the lower levels, Skyfish operations continued alongside the autonomous freight systems, the participating taxistas moving through the human access corridors when the machines handed them deliveries that required local knowledge or physical presence. Vasper told him about the meeting, not the memory, the negotiation. Tomas listened. You changed the deal. I changed the question. How? Instead of asking how much the land was worth, I asked who should receive the value created by the road. He thought about it. That's clever. No, it's old. Then why didn't they do it? Because everyone had been arguing about ownership. And you made them argue about value. She looked at him. You're doing it again. Doing what? Seeing the structure underneath the thing. He smiled. I can't help it. She stopped walking. Neither can I. The admission seemed to surprise them both. She told him about the woman. He listened carefully. When she finally described the map she had remembered, his expression changed. Mexico. She nodded. And infrastructure. Yes. Like what? I don't know. Did it look like the route map? No. She thought. It looked more like dependencies. He looked toward the skull. That's what I saw. They stood together. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Tomas opened his notebook. I wrote something this morning. Vasper looked at him. He showed her the page. It contained the same kind of diagram he had drawn earlier, but this time he had added several nodes. A charging station, a communications relay, a logistics depot, a financial settlement point, a human dispatch office. Vasper stared. My map had those. Tomas looked at her. Exactly. Not exactly. She took out her notebook. She drew the nodes she remembered. They were not identical, but they overlapped. Enough to matter. Neither of them suggested that the memory had become clearer because they had spoken. They had promised themselves they would not do that. Instead, Vasper took a photograph of both pages and placed the originals back inside their notebooks. Tomorrow, she said, we compare them again. Tomas nodded. He looked at the two diagrams. What do you think they are? Vasper watched an autonomous freight carrier descend toward the lower deck. I think they're telling us how we used to think. About Mexico? Maybe. And why would we have been thinking about Mexico? She looked at him. I don't know. That answer no longer frightened her as much as it had. There was a difference between ignorance and uncertainty. Ignorance meant there was nothing to work with. Uncertainty meant there was something there. The following morning, Vasper returned to the old diplomatic facility alone. The woman was gone. On the desk was a message. I couldn't tell you everything. Not yet. But there is one thing you should know. You were not made redundant because your mission was finished. You made yourself redundant because you had discovered that your mission was changing. Vasper read the sentence twice. Below it was another. You were supposed to disappear before anyone realized what you had learned. She stood in the empty office for a long time. Then she folded the paper and put it in her notebook. She did not understand it. Not yet. But somewhere inside the machinery of her damaged memory, another piece had moved into place. She had not spent her career becoming unnecessary because she had lost ambition. She had done it because she had learned something about institutions, something about systems, something about what happened when a person became too necessary to a structure that was changing faster than the people inside it could understand. And perhaps that was why the phrase redundant had survived when so much else had disappeared. It had not been an insult. It had been a strategy. Vasper left the building and returned toward Aldea Zama. She did not know that years later, when the Mexican state itself would begin behaving as though it were being quietly reorganized from within, she would recognize the pattern before almost anyone else. She did not know that Tomas would recognize the physical dependencies surrounding it. She did not know that the two of them, precisely because their original programming had failed to keep them where they were supposed to remain, would eventually become capable of seeing a system that had been designed to hide itself inside another. For now, all she knew was that she had once made herself redundant for a reason, and she was beginning to remember what it was. Chapter 126. The PCU. Tomas did not remember the landing. That was the first thing he understood clearly. Not that he remembered it incorrectly. Not that the memory had been blocked. He could remember leaving. Then there was nothing. The gap had always bothered him, but until the photograph appeared, he had assumed that the missing interval was simply another consequence of the God mode architecture. Now he understood that the absence itself might be evidence. He sat alone in the maintenance room beneath the skull, the notebook open in front of him, while the autonomous systems moved through their morning routines around him. The room had originally been intended for equipment diagnostics, But the Robotics Guild had gradually turned it into a workshop where human technicians could work without surrendering control to the automated maintenance systems. The distinction was becoming important throughout Aldea Zama. Machines were increasingly capable of doing things humans could not do safely or efficiently, but the guilds were discovering that there were still situations in which the best machine was the one being watched by somebody who understood why it might be wrong. Tomas had begun spending time there because the machines did not ask questions. A technician might notice that he was staring at a motor housing for too long. A robot simply waited. He preferred the robots. On the workbench lay a dismantled Skyfish navigation unit. One of the participating operators had brought it in after a drone had begun reporting intermittent positional errors. The fault turned out to be mundane: a damaged sensor housing and a connection that had loosened under repeated vibration. Tomas had found it in less than 5 minutes. The technician who had been working on it looked at him with a mixture of admiration and irritation. "You've done this before." Tomas shook his head. "No. You looked at the board once." "I know. And you knew." "I didn't know. I saw it." The technician laughed. "That's the same thing." "No." Tomas returned his attention to the unit. "It isn't." He could not explain why. He had begun to notice that distinction everywhere. There were things he knew because he had learned them. There were things he knew because someone had taught him. And then there were things he simply saw. The third category was becoming more common. At 10 that morning, the old engineer brought him upstairs. Vasper was waiting in the room where they had begun their memory work. She had her notebook open. Tomas carried his. Neither had spoken to the other about what they had remembered since the previous evening. The old engineer placed a small archival device on the table. This came through an old channel. Tomas looked at it. "What is it?" "Your PCU record." He felt something tighten behind his ribs. "Who authorized access?" "Nobody." Tomas looked at him. The engineer corrected himself. "The authorization was embedded in the record." "That's convenient." "It's not convenience." "What is it?" "Legacy." Vasper closed her notebook. "What does PCU stand for?" The engineer looked at Tomas. "Personal Continuity Unit." Tomas stared at him. "That's what I was in?" "Yes." "I thought PCU meant something else." "It meant several things depending on the program." Vasper leaned forward. "Explain it." The engineer sat down. "The conventional explanation is that a PCU was a protected environment for long-duration persistence. But that description is incomplete. A persistent asset operating in an environment where biological, psychological, and computational continuity could be interrupted needed more than life support. It needed a controlled context in which the asset's identity could remain stable while the surrounding environment changed. Tomas frowned. "That sounds like a prison." "It could become one." Vasper watched him. "Was it?" The engineer looked at the device. "Sometimes." Tomas said nothing. The engineer activated the archive. A sequence appeared. Dates, orbital coordinates, medical readings, operational classifications, then a designation, PCU 17. Tomas felt the room shift. Not physically. Something inside him recognized the number. "That's mine." The engineer nodded. The archive continued. Persistent asset, T17. Tomas looked at Vasper. She had gone pale. "What?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nothing." "Vasper." "I know the designation." "How?" "I don't know." The old engineer looked between them. That was the first indication that the archive contained more than Tomas's history. The record began with his deployment. The orbital environment had not been a conventional mission. Tomas had not been sent into orbit merely to perform maintenance or research. His assignment had involved monitoring a distributed infrastructure network whose physical components were located across multiple environments. Orbit, surface, ocean, subsurface, remote terrestrial installations. The system required an operator who could understand how failures in one environment affected the others. Tomas read the description twice. That's why I was there. Yes. Why me? The engineer did not answer. Tomas scrolled farther. The record contained aptitude assessments, systems perception, cross-domain reasoning, autonomous operations, fault anticipation, human-machine coordination. The list continued. Tomas stopped. These are not skills. What do you mean? They're preferences. The engineer looked at him. Tomas pointed. Some of these things I don't remember learning. Vasper understood. They selected you because of how you naturally perceived systems. The engineer nodded. Among other things. Among what other things? He hesitated. Your adaptability. Tomas laughed once. That's a polite word for it. Yes. He looked at the orbital record again. There was a section marked behavioral deviation. His expression changed. What is that? The engineer tried to close the window. Tomas stopped him. No. There isn't much detail. Then show me what there is. The engineer hesitated. Vasper intervened. Show him. The record opened. At first there were routine reports. The asset had begun modifying standard procedures. The asset had requested expanded access to system diagnostics. The asset had challenged mission assumptions. The asset had identified dependencies outside the original operational envelope. Then the language changed. Asset demonstrates increasing resistance to procedural constraints. Tomas smiled bitterly. There I am. Vasper looked at him. He continued reading. Asset remains functional. Then, asset remains useful. Then, asset may no longer be considered fully compliant. The final entry before the record changed classification was different. Recommend continuity preservation. Tomas stared. Why preserve me if I wasn't compliant? The engineer answered quietly. Because you were finding things. What things? We don't know. Tomas looked at him. You're lying. The engineer did not respond. Vasper did. He's not lying. Tomas looked at her. How do you know? Because he's afraid of the answer. The engineer looked at her. She had said it without calculation, without diplomatic polish, just observation. For a moment she seemed surprised by her own certainty. Tomas closed the archive. Continue. The next section concerned the return to Earth. There was very little information. That was unusual. The orbital record should have contained a complete transfer sequence. Instead, there was a gap. Tomas's final orbital status was recorded as stable. Then, transfer authorized. After that, surface recovery failed. Then, persistent asset status. Unresolved. Tomas read the line again. Surface recovery failed. The engineer nodded. What does that mean? We don't know. That's impossible. It happened. Then what happened to me? We found traces. Where? Not where you were supposed to land. Tomas looked at him. Where? The engineer opened a geographic map. A region appeared. Mexico. Tomas leaned closer. The location was nowhere near the official recovery zone. It was inland. The coordinates meant nothing to him. Then they changed. A second layer appeared. Historical transportation routes. Emergency corridors. Old infrastructure. He recognized one. Not because he remembered being there. Because his body reacted. He stood. That's where I went. Vasper looked at him. How do you know? I don't. He pointed. The road. What about it? I remember walking beside it. The engineer zoomed in. The route was old. Some of the road no longer existed. Tomas stared at the map. He could smell dust. Hot metal. wet vegetation. He could hear something mechanical behind him. He turned. Nothing. He closed his eyes. A fragment appeared. He was moving quickly, not running, walking with purpose. There were people nearby. Someone shouted. He did not understand the words. He remembered being angry, not afraid, angry. Then he remembered something else. He had been carrying something, a small device. He opened his eyes. What happened after the landing? The engineer looked at the archive. We don't know. Tomas looked at Vesper. She had tears in her eyes. He hadn't noticed until then. Why are you crying? She wiped her face. I don't know. The answer frightened her. She took her notebook. She wrote. Tomas was angry after the landing. Then, I don't know why I know this. She closed it. The old engineer continued the archive. The next surviving record was not orbital. It was terrestrial. A security incident. An unidentified individual had been observed moving through a restricted area. No identification. No records. No recognized biometric profile. The individual had disabled 2 automated systems without damaging them. He had bypassed a security checkpoint. He had taken food. He had disappeared. Tomas read the description. That's me. The engineer nodded. Vesper looked at him. How long? 3 months. Tomas stared. 3 months. Yes. Where? The engineer brought up the map. The locations formed a rough path through the region. Not random. Tomas recognized the pattern immediately. He was testing the perimeter. The engineer looked at him. Who? Tomas pointed at the map. Me. He moved between the locations. This wasn't wandering. Vesper stepped closer. What was it? I was learning. Learning what? Where the systems were. He looked at the map. The cameras, the drones, the roads, the checkpoints, the people. The engineer looked increasingly uncomfortable. You were feral. Tomas nodded. I know. But you were not irrational. Tomas looked at him. Those aren't the same thing. No. The old engineer sat down. They thought you had degraded. Did I? No. Then what happened? We don't know. Tomas looked at the record. I do. Both of them looked at him. He pointed to the map. They stopped treating me like an asset. Vesper understood before the engineer did. They treated you like an escaped system. Tomas nodded. And I treated them like a hostile system. Nobody spoke. The implications were unpleasant. His feral period had not been random deterioration. It had been an adaptation. He had awakened without context, without mission parameters, without institutional support, and with a sophisticated operational architecture still functioning inside him. He had done what he had been designed to do. He had mapped the environment. He had identified threats. He had avoided capture. He had learned how the system around him worked. The tragedy was that nobody recognized it as competence. They recognized it as madness. That evening Tomas went outside alone. He walked through Aldea Zama without a destination. The district was changing around him. The new high-rise rose above the vegetation, its geodesic exclosure beginning to look less like an architectural provocation and more like a piece of machinery that had been waiting for the rest of the city to catch up. The solar surfaces absorbed the remaining light. The opposite side of the structure reflected the first hints of the coming illumination cycle. Below, autonomous carriers moved quietly. A Skyfish drone crossed above him. A participating taxista followed along the road beneath it. The two systems were not competing. They were cooperating. Tomas watched them until they disappeared. Then he realized that he had been unconsciously calculating their trajectories. Distance, speed, wind, battery state, road condition. arrival time. He stopped. The information remained in his mind. He did not need to calculate it consciously. That was what frightened him. He opened his notebook. He wrote, "The machine does not make me intelligent. Then, it makes some forms of perception difficult to turn off." He paused, then added, "I don't know whether that is a gift or damage." He closed the notebook. Vasper was waiting for him when he returned. She did not ask what he had remembered. She simply took his hand. He held hers. After a moment he said, "I was never supposed to come back." She looked at him. "According to the record?" "Yes." "That's not the same thing." "What do you mean?" "The record says your recovery failed." He looked at her. "It doesn't say your return was impossible." He thought about that. "No." She squeezed his hand. "And you're here." He looked toward the skull. "Yes." Neither of them knew yet that the distinction would eventually become central to everything that followed. For the moment, the PCU record had answered only one question. Tomas had not simply been lost in orbit. He had come back from somewhere the system itself had failed to understand. And somewhere inside that failure was the beginning of the person he had become. Chapter 127. Persistent Assets. The word asset had always bothered Tomas, although he could never have explained why. He had heard it used often enough during the first weeks after his return. People spoke about assets the way mechanics spoke about components and administrators spoke about budgets. There were mobile assets, strategic assets, dormant assets, recoverable assets, persistent assets. The terminology was efficient because it avoided the inconvenience of deciding what a thing was before deciding what could be done with it. Now that he knew he had been one of them, the word had acquired a different weight. He sat across from the old engineer in the same room where they had examined the PCU records. Vasper was there as well, though she had positioned herself slightly away from the table. She had begun doing that whenever technical discussions became too close to her own history. It was not avoidance. It was concentration. She had discovered that proximity sometimes encouraged her mind to fill gaps too quickly. The old engineer opened another archive. This is what they called the Persistent Asset Program. Tomas looked at the title. How many were there? The engineer hesitated. Depends what you mean by were. Tomas smiled without humor. I've heard that answer before. This time it's important. He brought up a series of records. The designations appeared in columns. Some were complete. Others were damaged. Some ended abruptly. A few were marked recovered. Several were marked terminated. Others carried classifications Tomas did not understand. Then there were the ones with no final status at all. Vasper leaned toward the screen. How many? Known? Yes. 37. Tomas stared. And the unknown? The engineer did not answer. Vasper did. There are more. The engineer looked at her. She pointed toward the lower portion of the archive. Those records don't end. They disappear. That's the same thing. No. She enlarged one. A persistent asset had been deployed to a remote environment, then removed from the active registry. There was no death record, no recovery record, no termination order, just silence. Tomas understood. Still out there. Possibly. The old engineer nodded. That is one of the things the program never resolved. Tomas looked at the list again. Why didn't you find them? We weren't looking. Why? Because after the program was shut down, the assumption was that the surviving assets were either dead, integrated into other systems, or no longer functional. Tomas looked at him. And now we know the assumption was wrong. The room became quiet. Vasper looked at the designations. How many of us were actually God mode? The engineer stared at the screen. That term was never official. You know what I mean? He nodded. Not all persistent assets were the same. Explain. There were different generations and architectures. Some were heavily constrained. Some were designed for specific operational environments. Some had more autonomy than others. Some had what later engineers called God mode capabilities. Tomas frowned. What did that mean? Broad spectrum adaptation, elevated access to environmental systems, expanded learning authority, ability to modify operational behavior without requiring external approval. That sounds like a terrible idea. It was an extraordinary idea. That's not an answer. It was both. Vasper looked at the old engineer. And what happened when those systems went wrong? He glanced at Tomas. They didn't always go wrong. Tomas did. No. The engineer's answer came immediately. Tomas looked at him. What? You were classified as a failure. Yes. That classification was wrong. The statement hung in the room. The engineer continued. You adapted beyond the mission envelope. The people monitoring you interpreted adaptation as degradation because they were measuring obedience rather than function. Tomas sat back. So God mode wasn't madness. No. Then what was it? Permission. For what? To become more capable than the system that deployed you. That was the first time the old engineer used the word permission. It changed the conversation. Until then, Tomas had imagined God mode as a kind of forbidden operating state, something engineers had accidentally left open or deliberately hidden. The engineer's explanation suggested something stranger. God mode had not simply removed restrictions. It had changed the relationship between the asset and its environment. A conventional autonomous system received an objective and attempted to satisfy it. A God mode system could question the objective. That distinction had been considered useful in environments where the original mission could become obsolete. Orbit was one. Deep ocean infrastructure was another. Long-duration diplomatic assignments were another. Any environment where communications could fail, authorities could change, and conditions could evolve beyond what the original designers had anticipated required an intelligence capable of revising its own assumptions. The problem was obvious. Once an intelligence could revise the assumptions of the people who created it, the people who created it no longer had complete control. So they shut it down, Tomas said. Eventually. Why not immediately? Because it worked. Tomas laughed. Of course. The engineer looked at him. That was the problem. Vasper had been quiet. She was reading the list of assets. Something about the designations disturbed her. Not the number, the pattern. She recognized the institutional language surrounding several deployments. The phrasing was similar to diplomatic memoranda she had encountered during her career. Certain assets had been assigned not to governments but to transitional environments. Regions where governance was changing, where institutions were weak, where no single authority could guarantee continuity. She remembered arguing against one of those deployments. She could not remember which. She closed her eyes. The conference room returned. Someone had presented a proposal. The argument had been that a persistent asset could maintain continuity during a period of institutional instability. Vasper had objected. She remembered saying, "Continuity of what?" The room had gone quiet. The presenter had answered, "The system." She had replied, "Which system?" The memory ended there. Vasper opened her eyes. "I think I know what the diplomatic assets were for." Tomas looked at her. She spoke slowly. "They weren't there to represent governments." The old engineer waited. "They were there to observe transitions." Political transitions? Not just political ones. She looked at the asset registry. Systems transitions. She pointed to several deployments. Whenever authority was changing hands, infrastructure was being privatized, autonomous systems were being introduced, or a government was becoming dependent upon a new technical system, someone needed to understand the transition from inside. Tomas thought about his own orbital assignment. Same thing. Different environment. Same function. The engineer nodded. Exactly. Vasper looked at him. Then we weren't agents. No. What were we? Interfaces. The word landed differently than asset. An interface did not necessarily control either side of a system. It allowed two systems to communicate. Tomas looked at the map they had recovered from the old photograph. Mexico. Indonesia. The Philippines. Other nodes. Interfaces between what? The engineer closed the registry. That is what the program stopped being able to answer. The following afternoon, Tomas visited the Robotics Guild. He had become increasingly useful there, although nobody had formally assigned him a role. The guild's technicians had discovered that he was unusually good at identifying failures that conventional diagnostics missed. He could walk into a maintenance bay, watch a machine operate for a few minutes and identify which component was behaving incorrectly. Sometimes he was wrong. When he was wrong, he admitted it. When he was right, he rarely knew why. The guild had stopped asking. A quadruped prototype stood in the center of the workshop. It was not elegant. The designers had deliberately avoided making it elegant. It had broad feet, redundant joints, and a body shaped around maintenance rather than appearance. The machine was intended for ground truther territory, where conventional roads were to be avoided wherever possible. It could carry supplies, equipment, and people over terrain that would have required destructive road construction. The prototype was attempting to climb a simulated slope. Failed. The machine backed up. Tried again. Failed. The engineer controlling it adjusted the gate parameters. Tomas watched. You're correcting the wrong thing. The engineer frowned. The rear actuator? No. The center of gravity? No. The foot placement? No. What then? Tomas walked closer. The machine doesn't trust the ground. The engineer stared at him. What? It keeps trying to maintain a stable centerline. The terrain isn't stable enough. He crouched. Let it move sideways. The engineer hesitated. That's not the programmed gate. I know. If it loses lateral stability, it won't. How do you know? Tomas looked at the machine. I don't. The engineer made the change. The quadruped tried again. This time it climbed. The room became silent. Tomas stood. The machine reached the top of the simulated slope and stopped. The engineer stared at the controls. You just changed the locomotion model. No, you did. Tomas shook his head. I changed the assumption. The engineer looked at him. What assumption? That the ground should cooperate. Nobody laughed. The phrase was simple, but the engineers understood what he meant. The machine had been designed around an implicit assumption that terrain was an obstacle to be negotiated while preserving a stable internal model. Tomas had treated the terrain as a participant in the movement. The quadruped adjusted. The engineers began taking notes. Tomas walked away. He did not realize that Vasper had been watching from the doorway. She had heard the last exchange. You're doing it again, she said. Tomas turned. Doing what? Seeing the thing underneath the thing. He looked at the quadruped. I think that's what they made me for. That evening they returned to the apartment together. Vasper opened her notebook. I remembered another thing. Tomas sat opposite her. What? She hesitated. I don't think I was trained to negotiate. What were you trained to do? To detect changes in institutional behavior before they became visible. Tomas considered that. That's more specific. Yes. How? She opened the notebook but did not read from it. I remembered a briefing. There was a country undergoing a political transition. Everyone was looking at the elections. I was looking at procurement. Why? Because procurement changes before politics does. Tomas smiled. That sounds like something I'd say. That's what bothers me. Why? Because I don't think we were trained separately. He looked at her. She continued. I think our architectures were designed to complement one another. He remembered the map, the nodes, the photograph, the orbital facility. Maybe that's why the protocol calls us a pair. Maybe. And maybe that's why they separated us. She nodded. Neither wanted to say the obvious possibility. If the two of them had been designed to analyze complex systems from different directions, then their separation might not have been a safety precaution. It might have been containment. The thought changed the way Tomas looked at the room. The windows, the doors, the communications equipment, the building itself. For the first time, he wondered whether the skull was merely where they had happened to meet, or whether something had been waiting for them there. Vasper noticed his expression. What? I don't know. She smiled. Good. Good. You're finally learning. The next morning, the old engineer brought them a second archive. It was smaller, more heavily damaged. Its title had been partially corrupted. Only 2 words remained visible. God Mode. Below them was a list of operational principles. The first concerned adaptive autonomy. The second concerned environmental learning. The third concerned distributed authority. The fourth concerned continuity. The fifth had been redacted. Tomas stared at the missing section. Why is that one gone? I don't know. Vasper leaned toward the display. She felt the pressure behind her eyes again. A memory emerged. Not a room. A voice. Her own. If you give them the authority to override the system, you have to give them the authority to refuse the mission. She opened her eyes. That's it. The old engineer looked at her. What? I remember what God Mode was. Tomas waited. Vasper looked at him. It wasn't permission to do anything. She took a breath. It was permission to say no. The engineer looked down. Yes. Tomas felt something loosen inside him. For years he had thought of his refusal, his feral period, his inability to return to the role assigned to him, as evidence that something inside him had broken. Perhaps it had. But perhaps the break had happened somewhere else. Perhaps the system had been designed to allow refusal, and the people operating it had forgotten what that permission meant. The old engineer closed the archive. That's why so few people were trusted with it. Tomas looked at him. And that's why some of them are still out there. Possibly. How many? The engineer shook his head. We don't know. Vasper looked at the dark screen. Then we have another problem. Tomas looked at her. What? She thought of the photograph, the network of nodes, the territories, the systems. The old diplomatic warning. The people who built God Mode may have thought they were creating exceptional operators. She closed her notebook. But if they were actually creating people capable of refusing instructions, then some of those people may have spent years refusing things we never knew they were asked to do. Nobody answered. The skull continued operating around them. Below, Skyfish drones were moving through the morning routes. Human couriers were taking over where machines could not. The ground truthers were testing the new quadrupeds beyond the paved corridors. The professional guilds were turning what had once been unemployment into new forms of work. Aldea Zama was becoming more interconnected by the day. And somewhere beyond the visible network, there were still other persistent assets. Some dead, some lost. Some perhaps living ordinary lives without knowing what they were. Some perhaps knowing exactly what they were. Tomas looked at Vasper. Do you think they'll come? She shook her head. I think some of them already have. He looked toward the door. How do you know? She smiled faintly. I don't. For once, that was enough. Chapter 128. Cross-domain. The first thing Vasper noticed was that Tomas had stopped asking what he remembered. He had begun asking what the memory was connected to. It was a small change in language, but she understood why it mattered. The previous weeks had taught them that isolated memories were almost useless. A corridor without a destination was architecture. A voice without a conversation was sound. A face without context could belong to anyone. The mind wanted to complete these things, and the more emotionally important the missing pieces became, the more aggressively it attempted to supply them. Connections were different. If the same detail appeared in two independent memories, or if a memory could be corroborated by something neither of them had known beforehand, it acquired weight. Not certainty. They had become suspicious of certainty. But wait. They had therefore begun comparing structures rather than stories. Their notebooks had become less like diaries and more like archaeological records. Vasper's pages were filled with institutional diagrams, names she did not recognize, fragments of conversations, descriptions of rooms, and increasingly elaborate sketches of diplomatic relationships. Tomas's contained maps, mechanical systems, orbital trajectories, diagrams of infrastructure, and occasional drawings that looked to Vasper like the nervous system of some enormous animal. Neither notebook was particularly legible to anyone else. That was intentional. The old engineer had suggested that they establish a common notation, but Vasper rejected the idea. Not yet. Why? Because the moment we create a shared language, we'll begin interpreting one another's memories through it. Tomas had agreed. The engineer had not liked it, but he had stopped arguing. There was a growing recognition among the three of them that the experiment had become more consequential than any of them had expected. They were not simply recovering personal histories. They were discovering the architecture of two minds that had apparently been designed to observe systems from complementary directions. The difficulty was that neither knew where observation ended and intervention began. The first useful test came by accident. A disagreement had developed inside the skull's freight coordination system. Nothing serious had happened. A series of deliveries had been delayed because the autonomous routing layer had begun favoring one corridor over another. The software reported increased efficiency. The human operators disagreed. The Skyfishers claimed that the model was ignoring something that was obvious to anyone who had spent enough time outside the computational environment. The dispute had gone on for 2 days. The autonomous system was not malfunctioning. Its calculations were internally consistent. Under the conditions it had been given, the chosen route was superior. The problem was that the conditions were wrong. A seasonal change had altered the ground. One of the secondary roads was technically open but becoming unreliable after afternoon rainfall. A drainage channel had begun overflowing earlier than the model expected. None of the changes were dramatic enough to trigger a formal infrastructure alert, but together they made the route less dependable. The participating taxistas knew this because they had driven it. The Skyfishers knew it because the drones had been forced to alter their flight paths around the same area. The model did not know because nobody had yet told it. Tomas was brought in because one of the technicians had remembered his unusual ability to identify systemic problems. Vasper came with him. They stood in front of the logistics display while a Skyfisher explained the disagreement. The model says this corridor is 22% more efficient. It is. And you say it's wrong. It's wrong for the afternoon. Tomas looked at the display. Why? The Skyfisher pointed to the road. Because it floods. The autonomous system displayed no flood condition. Tomas looked at the historical data. How often? Depends on the rain. How much rain? Not much. Then why does it flood? The Skyfisher looked at him. Because the drainage was built for a different pattern. Tomas stared at the map. He enlarged the surrounding area. Then he asked Vasper, who approved the drainage? She looked at the institutional data. Municipal infrastructure. Who financed it? She followed the records. A development consortium. Who owned the adjacent land? She found the answer. Several entities. Related. She hesitated. Indirectly. Tomas looked at her. How indirectly? She began tracing the ownership structure. The answer became more complicated. The original developer had sold portions of the property to several investment vehicles. Those vehicles had different managers but shared a financial service provider. The service provider had no ownership stake in the properties, but it appeared repeatedly in the surrounding transactions. None of this was illegal. None of it was particularly interesting, except that the same financial service provider appeared in several unrelated infrastructure projects around the district. Vasper felt the old sensation behind her eyes. A room. A negotiation. A map. She looked again. This isn't about the road. Tomas looked at her. No. What is it? The road is an interface. He understood immediately. The logistics problem had exposed an institutional dependency. The infrastructure had been built according to one assumption. The environment had changed. The institutions responsible for the infrastructure had not changed with it. The system was functioning according to yesterday's arrangement while the physical world had already moved on. Tomas looked at the routing model. It's the same problem. Vasper knew what he meant. The model was not wrong. Its assumptions were obsolete. That distinction had begun appearing everywhere. The old engineer listened to their explanation without interrupting. When they finished, he asked a strange question. Which one of you found the problem? Tomas looked at Vasper. Vasper looked at Tomas. I found the physical dependency, he said. I found the institutional dependency. The engineer nodded. And together? We found the failure. Not quite. They waited. He pointed toward the logistics display. You found the relationship between them. Neither answered. The engineer leaned back. That's cross-domain reasoning. Tomas looked at him. That's what you called it. Yes. Is that what we were designed to do? The engineer hesitated. Yes. Then why separate us? The engineer looked at the screen. Because together you were difficult to control. Vasper's expression hardened. That's not the whole answer. No. What is? He did not answer immediately. Finally he said, because cross-domain reasoning changes the meaning of authority. Tomas frowned. Explain. A person who understands one system can be given authority over that system. A person who understands several systems can begin seeing how authority itself moves between them. Vasper understood before Tomas did. Which means you stop asking who is officially in charge and start asking who can actually make something happen. The engineer nodded. Tomas looked at Vasper. She was remembering. Not clearly, but enough. That night she dreamed of a meeting. She had been sitting at the far end of a long table. The room was darker than the one from her previous memories, and there were no windows. Projection occupied the wall. She remembered being younger. Not younger in body, younger in certainty. Someone had been explaining a transition in government infrastructure. A ministry was losing authority. A consortium was gaining it. A technical provider was gaining authority over the consortium. A financial institution was gaining leverage over the provider. A logistics network was becoming indispensable to all of them. The speaker had drawn a line between the organizations. Vasper had interrupted. You've drawn the relationships. The speaker looked at her. Yes. You haven't drawn the dependencies. What is the difference? Relationships tell you who talks to whom. She remembered standing. Dependencies tell you who can no longer afford to stop talking. The dream ended. She woke before dawn. The sentence remained intact. She wrote it down. Then she added another. I was not taught to negotiate agreements. I was taught to locate leverage. She stared at the words. They changed how she understood her entire career. Her diplomatic work had not merely been about bringing governments together. She had been trained to see the hidden architecture beneath formal institutions, which meant the redundancy she had once considered a professional virtue might have been something else. She had been trained to make herself unnecessary because her function was to identify the point at which another person could take over. She was not the permanent operator. She was the transition mechanism. That was why she had been so good at training replacements. She had not been abandoning missions. She had been completing them. Tomas's memory came differently. He was repairing a small pump when it arrived. The machine had a vibration. He had felt it before. He stopped working. The workshop disappeared. He was somewhere else. There was no earth beneath him. He knew that immediately. He was inside a service corridor, moving along a rotating structure. His body was restrained by a harness. The walls were covered in equipment. A blue indicator pulsed every few meters. He could hear another person breathing. He turned. There was no face, only a reflection in a curved panel. He was wearing a maintenance suit. Someone spoke through the communication system. "You're not authorized to modify that." Tomas remembered answering. "I know." "You'll compromise the system." "No. You don't have authority." Tomas remembered looking at the machinery. Then he remembered saying, "Neither does the failure." The memory broke. He dropped the tool. The workshop returned. The pump was still vibrating. Vasper found him several minutes later. She knew immediately that something had happened. He showed her the notebook. She read it. Then she looked at him. "You modified systems without authorization." "I think so." "Why?" "Because the system was failing." "Was it?" "I don't know." She smiled faintly. "Then you're consistent." He laughed. It was becoming easier to laugh about the strange pieces of their past. Not because they were harmless, because laughter gave them a way to remain human while examining things that had been designed to make humanity operational. The old engineer wanted to test them, not medically, computationally. He proposed giving each of them the same complex scenario and asking them to analyze it independently. Vasper objected. "We already know the result." "No, you don't." "What are you testing?" "Whether your recovered abilities are domain-specific or whether the cross-domain behavior itself survived." Tomas looked interested. Vasper was not. "What scenario?" The engineer opened a simulation. A fictional coastal state. An autonomous logistics network. A financial crisis. A government transition. Several competing infrastructure providers. Population movement. An environmental emergency. No real countries. No real institutions. No real data. The point was to prevent external knowledge from contaminating the exercise. They were given 2 hours. Vasper went first. She ignored the financial figures. Tomas would later discover that she had barely looked at them. Instead, she studied the institutional relationships. Who appointed whom? Which emergency powers existed? Which agencies had overlapping authority? Which organizations could delay decisions? Which organizations could accelerate them? Which people were formally powerful but practically isolated? At the end of her analysis, she identified 3 points of institutional fragility. The engineer asked why. "Because everyone is watching the cabinet." "Who should they watch?" "The people who can make the cabinet act." He smiled. Tomas's analysis looked completely different. He ignored the government chart. He mapped physical dependencies. Ports. Fuel. Communications. Warehouses. Roads. Power. Autonomous vehicle depots. He found 4 points of failure. The engineer asked him why. "Because if these 4 stop, the others become irrelevant." The 2 analyses were then overlaid. The institutional vulnerabilities and physical vulnerabilities intersected at one location. A communications and logistics hub. Vasper stared at it. Tomas looked at her. Neither had identified it directly. They had found it independently. The old engineer leaned forward. "This is the point." "What point?" Tomas asked. "The point where your architectures overlap." Vasper looked at him. She understood. Her skills answered the question. Who can make the system move? His answered another. What must remain functioning for the system to move? Together they answered the question neither could answer alone. Where does authority become operational? The old engineer closed the simulation. That's what they were afraid of. They did not discuss the implications until the following day. Instead, they went to the ground truthers territory. The quadruped program had reached another stage. Several machines were now operating outside the controlled test area, carrying supplies between dispersed settlements without requiring new paved roads. The ground truthers had initially regarded the machines with suspicion. That had changed. Not because they had fallen in love with robots, because the robots were useful. A woman named Mara showed them a route where one of the quadrupeds had carried water, tools, and food across terrain that would have been difficult even for a person on foot. You see that? She pointed toward a narrow passage between trees. That's where the old road would have gone. Tomas looked at the terrain. And now there isn't one. The quadruped continued along the trail. Mara watched it. I don't trust it. Tomas smiled. You shouldn't. She looked at him. What? You don't need to trust it. You need to know how to use it. She considered that. That's what you people say. Who are you people? People who think machines are inevitable. Tomas looked at the robot. They are. Mara frowned. That isn't the same as saying they're good. No. He watched the machine climb. That's why people still matter. Vasper looked at him. He had said it without thinking. Perhaps that was another thing the program had taught him. Or perhaps it was something he had learned since returning. They could no longer tell. On the way back, Vasper asked him about the simulation. You saw the infrastructure? Yes. I saw authority. Yes. Do you think that's what our missions were about? Tomas considered it. Maybe. And if it was? Then somebody was interested in transitions. Transitions between what? Systems. She looked out through the window. The skull appeared ahead of them. Its upper structure caught the late sunlight while the lower decks remained shaded by the surrounding buildings and vegetation. The building seemed simultaneously enormous and incomplete, as though its final purpose had not yet been decided. Vasper watched it approach. That's what TLP is doing. Tomas looked at her. Transitioning. Yes. From what to what? She thought about the question. I don't know. Good. She smiled. You've been spending too much time with me. They returned to the laboratory that evening. The old engineer had left a message. Do not connect the two systems. Vasper read it twice. Tomas looked at her. What does that mean? I don't know. She looked at the old God Mode archive. The redacted fifth principle remained inaccessible. For several minutes, neither touched the interface. Then Tomas noticed something. The system had begun processing something on its own. Not the reintegration protocol. Another process. A small diagnostic window appeared in the corner of the screen. Cross-domain compatibility. 87.4%. Tomas stared. We didn't run that. Vasper shook her head. No. The number changed. 87.5%. Then 87.6%. The system was learning, or measuring, or waiting. They could not tell which. Vasper reached for the power control. Tomas stopped her. Wait. Why? Because if we shut it down, we won't know what it was doing. And if we leave it running, we might. She looked at him. That was the problem with the two of them. Neither was particularly good at stopping once a system had begun revealing itself. The number changed again. 87.8%. Then the display went dark. No warning. No explanation. Just darkness. Vasper looked at Tomas. What did you do? Nothing. I know. They stood there in the darkened room. Outside, the skull continued its ordinary work. Freight moved. Drones flew. Humans drove. Robots walked. The district grew. Neither of them knew what the machine had measured. Neither knew why. But they had begun to understand something about the way their minds worked. Vasper could see how institutions moved. Tomas could see what kept systems moving. Neither of them had yet understood what happened when someone deliberately tried to make those two things appear unrelated. They would. Not yet, but soon enough. Chapter 129. The Price of Knowing. The machine remained dark for 11 seconds. Tomas counted them. He did not mean to. His attention simply fell into the rhythm of the interval, and by the time the display returned he knew the duration more precisely than the laboratory clock would later report it. Vasper noticed. You counted. I think so. Why? I don't know. The display came back without restoring the previous window. There was no diagnostic message, no warning, no record of the compatibility calculation. The interface looked exactly as it had before they entered the room, as though nothing had happened. The old engineer arrived 5 minutes later. He took one look at the screen and stopped. You ran it. No. Then it ran itself. Tomas nodded. The engineer went to the terminal and began checking the logs. Vasper watched his face. What? Nothing. You're doing that thing again. What thing? Reading something you don't want us to read. He turned toward her. I've seen this behavior before. Where? He looked at Tomas. Not here. That answer was enough to make the room colder. Tomas pulled a chair toward the terminal. Show me. The engineer hesitated. Then he opened an archived system log. There was no record of the compatibility calculation. No initiating process. No user request. No external trigger. The system had simply produced the number. Tomas frowned. That's impossible. No. It can't calculate without a process. It can. Then what did it use? The engineer enlarged the log. That's what I don't know. Vasper stepped closer. The calculation had not compared their memories. It had not accessed their notebooks. It had not queried their medical records. It had used something else. The engineer highlighted a line buried deep in the diagnostic information. Behavioral interface observation. Vasper read it twice. What does that mean? It means the system wasn't comparing your memories. Then what? Your decisions. Tomas looked at him. From when? The engineer scrolled. The answer was worse than either of them expected. Since you entered the facility. Vasper folded her arms. So it's been watching us. It has been observing system behavior. That's a distinction lawyers make. The engineer looked at her. Yes. Do you believe it? He did not answer. That was answer enough. They shut down the visible interface. They did not shut down the underlying system. The difference had become unavoidable. The skull depended upon too much infrastructure to be casually powered down. The logistics network, the maintenance systems, Skyfish operations, the robotics guild's test environments, and several independent municipal systems now depended upon portions of the computational architecture. Turning off one terminal did not make the system disappear. It merely made one part of it invisible. The old engineer insisted that the distinction between observation and intervention be documented. Vasper insisted that they establish their own boundaries. Tomas insisted on something simpler. Don't let it decide what we remember. Nobody objected. They spent the afternoon drawing lines. The first line concerned memory. The system could record that a memory event had occurred, but it could not generate an autobiographical reconstruction without explicit consent. The second concerned inference. The system could model their behavior for operational safety, but it could not silently classify their motives as facts. The third concerned communication. Neither of them wanted the system to begin adapting its responses to their individual psychological patterns without their knowledge. The old engineer listened. You understand that this reduces the system's effectiveness. Vasper looked at him. Yes. Significantly. Then it will have to become less effective. He smiled. That's not how most people speak about advanced systems. Most people aren't trying to remember whether they were programmed. The old engineer stopped smiling. Fair. They recorded the restrictions. The system accepted them. That, more than anything else, disturbed Tomas. Why did it agree? The engineer looked at the authorization log. Because the architecture recognizes your authority over your own continuity. Tomas stared at him. Why? I don't know. Vasper did. Or thought she did. Because someone made sure it would. The following morning, Tomas woke from a dream he could not remember. That alone was not unusual. What was unusual was that he knew the dream had contained a decision. He could feel its shape without knowing its content. He had stood somewhere high. There had been a large body of water below him. Something was moving beneath the surface. He had been asked whether he wanted to continue. He had said yes, then no, then something else. He wrote down what he could remember. Water, height, decision, 2 answers, third answer unknown. He stared at the page. Then he wrote, there was another person present. He stopped. The impulse to write Vasper's name was immediate. He resisted it. Instead, he drew a blank figure. No face. No body details. Just a position. She was there. Or someone was. He closed the notebook. At breakfast, Vasper was already awake. She had her own notebook beside her. Neither spoke about it. That had become part of their discipline. They could talk about everything else. Their relationship was becoming increasingly difficult to classify. They were not merely friends. They were not simply colleagues. They were not exactly partners in the conventional sense, although people around the skull had begun assuming they were. The truth was more complicated. They needed each other. That was the part neither wanted to romanticize. Need could be dangerous. They had both been designed for environments in which dependence created vulnerability. Their architectures had been built around autonomy, redundancy, and controlled communication. The emotional fact that they were beginning to make one another feel more complete could therefore not be treated as harmless. Vasper worried that she might be reconstructing an old attachment. Tomas worried that he might be constructing a new one because of the gaps in his memory. They had discussed this. The discussion had been uncomfortable. What if we were together before? Tomas had asked. Then we were. And what if we weren't? Then we're not obligated to become what we were. He had looked at her. You really believe that? Yes. Even if it turns out they designed us to work together? Especially then. She had taken his hand. Whatever they designed, this part is ours. He had not answered. He had simply held her hand more tightly. The first serious disagreement between them came 3 days later. It began with a document. Vasper had obtained another fragment from her former diplomatic network. It concerned a transition program in a country that had experienced a sudden change in government several decades earlier. She believed the document might contain information relevant to their old missions. Tomas disagreed. You don't know that. I recognize the architecture. That's not evidence. It is to me. No. She looked at him. No, you recognize a pattern. That's useful. But you don't know whether the pattern means what you think it means. She became angry. That's exactly what you've been doing. Yes. Then why is it acceptable when you do it? It isn't. The answer stopped her. He continued. I've been wrong. About what? Several things. Which ones? He looked down. I thought the photograph proved we had worked together. We may have. I thought the map meant Mexico. It may. I thought my feral period was caused by the system treating me as hostile. It may have been. He looked at her. But I don't know. Vasper was silent. She had been doing the same thing, turning fragments into narratives. The temptation was especially strong for her because narrative had been her profession. Diplomacy depended upon understanding events as sequences of intention, consequence, and response. A good diplomat could look at a scattered series of decisions and reconstruct the political logic beneath them. But memory was not diplomacy. Memory could not be negotiated. She sat down. You're right. Tomas looked surprised. I don't say that often, she added. I've noticed. She smiled. The argument dissolved. Not because either had won, because they had remembered the rule. That evening, the old engineer gave them access to another part of the God Mode archive. This time, he did not explain what they were looking for. You'll recognize it. The file contained no names, only principles, adaptive autonomy, distributed authority, cross-domain perception, continuity preservation, mission refusal. Then a sixth heading appeared. Unforeseen consequence management. Tomas stared. What's that? The engineer sat down. That was the problem. What problem? The entire philosophy of God Mode depended upon the assumption that sufficiently autonomous systems would produce consequences their designers could not anticipate. Vasper read the heading again. So they planned for that. They tried. How? By creating systems capable of evaluating their own consequences. Tomas frowned. That's circular. Yes. Then what stopped it? The engineer looked at them. Nothing. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This one contained a possibility. The old engineer continued. God Mode was not supposed to make perfect systems. It was supposed to make systems capable of remaining useful after their assumptions failed. Vasper understood. And if the assumption that the system had failed was itself wrong, then the system could become useful in ways nobody intended. Tomas leaned back. Like me. Like you. And Vasper. The engineer nodded. Perhaps. She looked at him. Perhaps. I don't know what happened to you. She smiled faintly. At least you're consistent. The archive contained one final warning. It had been written by hand. The handwriting was difficult to identify because the document had been scanned repeatedly and the original had been degraded. The old engineer enlarged it. There were only a few lines. Do not restore a persistent asset to its original mission without accounting for what the asset learned after the mission failed. Tomas read it twice. Vasper looked at him. That's us. Maybe. No. She pointed to the document. That's exactly us. Tomas shook his head. It's a general principle. Written for a specific reason. Probably. They looked at the old engineer. He finally admitted what he had avoided saying. It was written after the first major failure. What failure? He hesitated. A deployment where the asset completed its mission successfully but returned with a different understanding of what the mission had been. Vasper stared at him. What happened? The asset refused debriefing. What happened to it? The engineer looked toward the dark terminal. It disappeared. Tomas felt a familiar pressure behind his eyes. Where? We don't know. Vasper asked. Was it recovered? No. Dead. We don't know. Tomas looked at the list of unresolved assets. Then it may still be out there. Yes. The old engineer closed the archive. That's why we don't know how many remain. That night, Tomas and Vasper walked beyond the developed portion of Aldea Zama. The skull remained visible through the trees, its lights reflected against the clouds. The surrounding territory was changing slowly, almost imperceptibly. New structures appeared where temporary shelters had stood. Paths became established routes. Human movement increased. Machines became less remarkable. They walked without speaking for a long time. Finally, Vasper said, "Do you think we're failures?" Tomas thought about it. Compared with what? The original design. He considered the question seriously. "I think we failed at being what they wanted." She waited. "That isn't the same as failing." She smiled. "No." He looked at her. "Do you?" She looked toward the skull. "I think I became very good at disappearing. And now, I think I'm becoming bad at it." He laughed. "Good." She stopped walking. "Why?" "Because I like knowing where you are." She looked at him. The answer was so simple that it disarmed her. She took his hand. They continued. Neither noticed the small drone hovering several hundred meters away. It was not a Skyfish vehicle. It was not registered to the skull. It remained outside the local network's ordinary identification range for less than a minute before disappearing into the darkness. Tomas stopped. Vasper felt his hand tighten. "What?" He looked toward the trees. "I don't know." She waited. He stared for another few seconds. Then the feeling disappeared. Nothing. They continued walking. Neither knew whether the machine had been watching them. Neither knew whether anyone had sent it. Neither knew that the first unmistakable evidence of the larger conspiracy would eventually arrive through precisely this kind of apparently insignificant event. For now, the two of them were still occupied with a much more immediate question: whether the lives they were constructing after their return belonged to them, or whether they were simply another layer of programming they had not yet learned to recognize. The answer would not come from the archive. It would come from what they did next. Chapter 130. The Severance. The first arrivals did not look like refugees. That was what confused everyone. They arrived with luggage that cost more than most of the temporary structures surrounding the southern edge of Aldea Zama. They arrived with children who had tablets before they had learned where the nearest grocery store was. They arrived carrying professional credentials that had become almost meaningless in the cities they had left behind, and bank balances that, for a brief and peculiar period, made them wealthy enough to ignore that fact. Some came by air. Some came by road. Some came after spending several months moving between places that had once seemed like destinations and now felt like waiting rooms. Most had been told they were fortunate. The severance packages were generous. The stock grants had vested. The retention bonuses had been converted into departure payments. Some companies had even paid for relocation, counseling, education, and temporary housing as part of their workforce transition programs. The corporations called it responsible automation. The people receiving the money called it something else. The phrase that circulated among them was the severance generation. It was not an official designation. It was simply accurate enough to survive. They were the professionals who had been displaced after spending years building the systems that displaced them. Engineers whose departments had been reduced to supervisory teams. Architects whose software could produce more buildings in an afternoon than their firms had once designed in a year. Financial analysts whose models had become obsolete when the machines began modeling the models. Lawyers whose research departments had disappeared. Doctors whose diagnostic systems had become so good that the physicians remaining in the workflow were increasingly there to explain decisions rather than make them. Managers whose primary function had been coordinating people who no longer needed coordination. Writers, designers, researchers, consultants, programmers, executives, people whose jobs had not technically disappeared but whose authority had. That last category was the largest. They had money. They had education. They had time. And, increasingly, they had no idea what to do with any of the three. Aldea Zama offered them something few other places did. It did not ask them to pretend the old economy was coming back. It asked them what they wanted to build after it had gone. The first serious influx coincided with the completion of another section of the skull. The building had begun attracting attention beyond Tulum long before it was finished, but the attention had been mostly architectural. Photographs circulated of the geodesic exclosure, its two-sided skin divided between solar surfaces and programmable LED panels. People argued about whether the structure honored Mayan geometry or merely appropriated its visual vocabulary. Others argued about whether a building that stored autonomous aerial vehicles inside a giant protective enclosure was infrastructure, sculpture, or evidence that the region had finally lost its mind. The people arriving from the professional world were less interested in any of that. They wanted to know what happened inside. A software engineer from Austin spent 2 days walking around the lower decks before finally asking someone whether the building had a human resources department. The answer amused him. No. What happens if I want to work here? Find something useful to do. He laughed. I used to make $600,000 a year. The Skyfish operator beside him shrugged. Then you probably know how to do something. The engineer looked around. I don't know what. That's different. The conversation stayed with him. 3 months later, he was working with the Robotics Guild. He was not writing software. He was redesigning the diagnostic interface used by human maintainers. He earned less. He slept better. He told nobody that the first time he saw a quadruped carrying supplies through terrain without a road. He cried. The Severance professionals did not form a political movement. Not at first. They formed a labor market. That distinction mattered. They began meeting in cafes, workshops, temporary offices, and apartments around Aldea Zama. They compared severance agreements. They discussed what their former employers were doing with their old departments. They exchanged contacts and technical knowledge. They hired one another. Then they began pooling capital. Then they began creating guilds. The first guilds were informal. A group of former aerospace engineers began advising the autonomous transportation operators. Former hospital administrators started building protocols for human oversight of machine-run medical systems. Financial professionals created cooperative treasury services. Former corporate lawyers began working on contractual structures for autonomous organizations. A group of displaced architects began designing structures that could be dismantled and reconfigured rather than demolished. They had arrived expecting to become investors. They became participants. The distinction slowly changed Aldea Zama. Vasper watched the transformation from a distance at first. She had spent enough time around institutional transitions to recognize the pattern. A population had arrived with resources. The existing community had infrastructure but limited capital. The guilds had technical knowledge but limited institutional legitimacy. The ground truthers had territory and a powerful cultural argument but little interest in becoming another conventional development constituency. The Skyfish Cooperative had operational knowledge of the new logistics environment. The Robotics Guild had machines. The professional newcomers had severance money. None of those things was sufficient by itself. Together, they were beginning to resemble an economy. Vasper mentioned this to Tomas one afternoon while they were watching freight movements from an upper maintenance deck. You see the pattern? Tomas was watching the autonomous vehicles below. Which one? Money is arriving faster than institutions can absorb it. He looked at the new construction beyond the skull. That's usually when things go wrong. Usually. What are you seeing? She pointed toward the district. People who spent their entire careers inside corporations are suddenly free of them. That's good. Is it? He looked at her. They have money. They also have habits. What kind? Corporate habits. She watched a group of newly arrived professionals cross the plaza below. One was speaking into a phone while 2 others examined a property map. They're accustomed to solving problems by creating organizations. Tomas smiled. What's wrong with organizations? Nothing. She paused. Unless the problem is that the organization is the problem. He understood. Aldea Zama had begun precisely because people were experimenting with alternatives to that structure. The newcomers could either strengthen that experiment or quietly reproduce the institutions they had escaped. The difference would depend on what they did with their money. The answer began emerging at a meeting 3 days later. A former corporate strategist named Daniel Ortega had requested access to the Guild Council. He arrived wearing a linen jacket that looked expensive enough to have been designed to look inexpensive. Vasper disliked him immediately. She distrusted people who looked as though they had spent too much time learning how not to look wealthy. He began with a presentation. That made matters worse. He projected a financial model onto the wall. The model was sophisticated. Too sophisticated. It contained demographic projections, property values, labor participation, infrastructure utilization, autonomous vehicle penetration, and expected investment returns. When he finished, he smiled. The opportunity is obvious. Nobody responded. He looked around. The transition district has reached a point where external capital can accelerate development substantially. A ground truther representative shifted in his chair. A Skyfish operator looked at Vasper. The Robotics Guild representative leaned back. Daniel continued. With the right investment structure, we can scale the Skull's infrastructure, accelerate residential construction, increase autonomous logistics capacity, and create a professional services cluster capable of attracting additional displaced talent. Vasper finally spoke. Who owns the resulting infrastructure? Daniel looked at her. The investors. And the land. Existing arrangements remain intact. Until, he smiled, there is no reason to anticipate conflict. That's not an answer. The room tightened. Daniel looked toward the others. I'm proposing capital. Vasper shook her head. You're proposing ownership. Capital requires a return. Not necessarily. He looked genuinely surprised. Of course it does. No. She pointed toward the financial model. You've assumed that the only way to compensate capital is through ownership. That's how investment works. That's how your investment worked. She closed the laptop. You're not investing in a conventional development anymore. Daniel stared at her. Then what am I investing in? Vasper looked around the room. Transition. Nobody spoke. She continued. If you want to participate in what is being built here, then your capital should have a claim on what the transition produces. That does not automatically mean you own the place where the transition occurs. Daniel looked at Tomas. You agree with her? Tomas had been silent. I don't know. Daniel smiled. Finally. Tomas looked at the model. Your projections are wrong. The smile disappeared. Which ones? All the ones that assume behavior remains stable after people stop working for corporations. Daniel stared at him. Tomas pointed toward the screen. You're modeling employment as though people will replace their old jobs with new jobs. That's the normal transition. No. Tomas enlarged the labor model. Look here. The numbers changed. You're assuming that the people arriving will seek salaried employment. That's what professionals do. Not after they receive a large enough severance package. Daniel frowned. What do you think they'll do? Tomas looked through the window. Build things. The phrase circulated after the meeting. Build things. It became almost embarrassing in its simplicity. The displaced professionals had spent years optimizing corporations. Now they had to optimize themselves. Some became entrepreneurs. Some became patrons. Some became teachers. Some joined guilds. Some invested in infrastructure. Some bought land. Some founded research cooperatives. Some simply disappeared into the region and opened restaurants, workshops, studios, and small businesses. A few became ground truthers. That caused friction. The newcomers had money. The ground truthers had territory. Each group feared the other. The ground truthers suspected that the professionals would eventually buy them out. The professionals suspected that the ground truthers wanted to exclude anyone who had not arrived with the original movement. The guilds tried to mediate. The municipal authorities watched nervously. The hotel industry saw opportunity. The political class saw votes. And beneath all of it, the skull continued expanding. Tomas encountered one of the newcomers in the robotics workshop. She was a former systems engineer from a European autonomous vehicle company. She had been laid off 6 months earlier and had arrived with enough money to avoid working for several years. She had spent those 6 months doing almost nothing. "I thought I would enjoy it," she told him. "Did you? For 3 weeks. What happened?" "I realized I had spent 20 years becoming useful to machines." Tomas looked at her. "What's wrong with that?" "Nothing." She looked toward the quadruped. "I just don't know what I'm useful to now." Tomas considered the machine. "Do you know why this one falls?" She smiled. "Probably. Then you're useful." She laughed. "That's your recruitment strategy?" "No. What is it?" "Fix the thing in front of you." She looked at him. "That's it. For now." She took off her jacket. "Show me the machine." By the end of the month, the Robotics Guild had recruited 12 former professionals. None had been hired. They had simply started showing up. The guild began issuing stewardship shares rather than salaries for certain projects. Contributors accumulated claims based on documented work, maintenance responsibility, and successful improvements. The system was imperfect. That was precisely why it was interesting. It was not yet an economy. It was becoming one. The old categories were beginning to blur. Employee, investor, patron, engineer, citizen, guild member, landholder, operator. The severance professionals moved between them. Some were uncomfortable. Others became almost evangelical. One former corporate executive told a local reporter that Aldea Zama was the first place he had ever lived where money did not automatically tell him what role he occupied. The quote appeared in several newspapers. The Hotel Association hated it. The guilds loved it. The ground truthers ignored it. Vasper clipped the article and put it in her notebook. She did not know why. There was another reason the severance influx mattered. The newcomers brought information. Not secrets, patterns. They knew how large corporations behaved when they entered new markets. They knew what happened when investment funds arrived. They knew how consultants reframed political problems as efficiency problems. They knew how technology companies acquired local partners. They knew how corporate lawyers structured ownership so that nobody appeared to control an asset while several parties could nevertheless exercise decisive influence over it. They knew how to recognize the early stages of institutional capture. Most had spent their careers inside the machines that performed it. Aldea Zama was beginning to acquire something it had not planned for. A middle class of people who understood the old world from the inside and had enough capital to refuse to return to it. They were not revolutionaries. They were not necessarily idealists. Many of them simply wanted a life that made sense. That made them potentially more important than either category. One evening, Vasper attended a gathering at the apartment of a former financial analyst. There were perhaps 20 people there. Some were from the professional guilds. Others had only recently arrived. A few had already invested in local infrastructure. The conversation moved between severance taxation, housing, education, autonomous transport, and the growing problem of people arriving without knowing what role they wanted to play. Then someone asked Vasper a question. "What do you think this place is becoming?" She looked around the room. The people sitting there were exactly the kind of people she had spent years negotiating with. Except now they were not representing corporations. They were representing themselves. "I don't know," she said. Someone laughed. "That's your answer?" "Yes." "You're the diplomat." "Exactly." The room quieted. She continued, "I've spent most of my life watching institutions form. One thing I've learned is that the people inside them are usually the last to understand what they're becoming." Someone asked, "Then how do you know when you've crossed the line?" "You don't. That's bleak." "No." She thought of Tomas. The useful thing is to build systems that can survive being wrong. The room became quiet again. She did not explain where the phrase came from. She wasn't sure herself. Later that night, Tomas met her outside. He had been working with the Robotics Guild. She told him about the gathering. He listened. Do you think they'll stay? Some will. Some won't. Of course. Why? She considered the question. Because not everyone wants transition. What do they want? The old world. He looked at the skull. Can they have it? No. Why? Because the machines already have it. He laughed. She did too. Then she became serious. Tomas. Yes. I think something is changing. Everything is changing. No. Something specific. She told him about the corporate habits she had seen in the newcomers, and the way some of them were beginning to understand that they could use their capital without reproducing the organizations that had once employed them. Tomas listened. Then he said, maybe that's why they came. Why? Because they have nothing left to lose. Vasper looked at him. They have millions. That's not the same thing. She understood. Money could preserve a lifestyle, could not restore a purpose. The severance had purchased time. Aldea Zama was offering a place to spend it. The next morning, a new notice appeared on the guild board. It was not issued by the municipality. It was not issued by the Skull. It was not issued by any corporation. It was signed by a dozen former professionals who had arrived during the previous 6 months. We are looking for people who want to build what comes after employment. Underneath was a list. Robotics, autonomous transport, ecological construction, distributed energy, food systems, education, governance, arts, hospitality, infrastructure, research. No salaries were promised. No equity was promised. No particular ideology was required. The final line read, bring what you know, bring what you don't know. We'll figure out the difference together. By noon, the list was covered in handwritten additions. By evening, the board had been moved to a larger wall. Nobody had planned it. That was becoming characteristic of Aldea Zama. The transition district was no longer merely receiving displaced people. It was beginning to absorb them. And with every new arrival, the distinction between those who had built the old economy and those trying to build the next one became less useful. The severance had been intended as compensation for a world that had disappeared. In Aldea Zama, some of that money was becoming something else. Not investment, not charity, not employment. Seed capital for a society that had not yet decided what to call itself. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Restax. Recent episodes. Persistent Service Asset Part 16. 2 hours ago. Persistent Service Asset Part 15. 14 hours ago. Persistent Service Asset Part 14. August 13th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X.
Sovereign without spectacle. We claim our own path.
Pirate First's Outlaw Secession, burning the Admiral's map. To truly comprehend the Zeta Mail, ye must look past the petty posturing of the shorebound world and examine the uncompromising ethos of the High Seas Pirate Charter.
Watching perfect narratives slip through their own hands.
The people who are already here. A note for the untabulated. The algorithms say you don't exist. The institutions say you are statistically insignificant. The market says there are not enough of you to matter. And yet here you are. Again. Reading things nobody is supposed to read. Thinking thoughts nobody is supposed to think. The pretending is getting harder. Not because people are waking up, that's too romantic. Because the distance between the official story and the lived reality has widened to the point where maintenance takes visible effort. What you're looking for, what brought you here, is not someone to tell you what to think. You've already done the thinking. What you're looking for is proof that someone else did the thinking too, arrived somewhere close to where you are, and didn't collapse under the weight of it. That's this. Not a movement. Not a faction. Not a subscription to someone else's conclusions.
The waiting game is already underway. Occupy, build, garden, govern.
I just finished writing a book I didn't plan to write. It started as a countercultural addendum to the Aldiyazama, Post-Corporate Transition District Handbook, a rougher, more urgent document aimed at the generation the credential economy forgot to accommodate. It became something else.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap.